Anyone who has ever been privileged to direct a film also knows that although it can be like trying to write War and Peace in a bumper car in an amusement park, when you finally get it right, there are not many joys in life that can equal the feeling.
Let me just say that I don't think there's anybody that hasn't been influenced by Stanley Kubrick.
Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick was one of the most innovative film directors in the history of cinema. When he died on March 7, 1999, he left behind an astonishing body of work.
Kubrick is one of those ultimate filmmaker. He is is a very rare kind of filmmaker that is cherished by audiences, but also by filmmakers. Filmmakers constantly reference Kubrick. So I think the influence is just, even if you don't try to think about it, the ghost of Kubrick is always around when you're trying to do something.
Do you recognize this song? Think for a second. Even if you don't know its name or the composer who made it, most listeners should be able to recognize this classic tune. Now, I'm willing to bet even more of you know this one, but picking out exactly how you know it might be harder for some listeners. These are two of the most famous and recognizable classical compositions in music history, similar in stature and cultural relevance to some of the most widely regarded works of Beethoven and Mozart. Those names should ring some bells. But what about Richard and Johann Strauss, the two composers behind these pieces of music? The bells have likely stopped ringing if you're not a classical music aficionado. Now, why exactly is that? How can we, in a sense, know these works of classical music even though we may not know their titles, who composed them, or even how we know the song at all in the first place? It's because these songs have become so ingrained in our cultural zeitgeist that they have become divorced from their original context and retooled for countless other uses and contexts, much in the same way that certain images evolve into memes in our modern culture. Although he was certainly not the first, nor shall be the last, there once existed an artist so bold, so unique, so culturally impactful, that his work has become the concrete context in which other works of art are interpreted, while simultaneously being impactful enough that his own work has impacted some of the greatest and well-known ventures in art and popular entertainment today. That person is filmmaker Stanley Kubrick, who's perhaps best known in popular culture as the director of the 1980 horror classic The Shining. Kubrick is considered one of the very best, most important, and incredibly influential filmmakers of all time. His career spanned decades, and saw the director create one timeless work of art after another before his untimely death in 1999. His films have permeated our culture on such a profound level that some of their most memorable components have become divorced from their original contexts and have since been repurposed for a wide array of other uses, such as with Blue Danube, or also Sprach Zarathustra, which were first put in a contemporary context and introduced to mass audiences in Kubrick's 1968 masterwork, 2001: A Space Odyssey. When you hear either of these songs in a movie, TV show, or any other piece of entertainment, it's a reference to the indelible mark that Kubrick left on our culture, one that is still prevalent to this day. In his 1998 article, Kubrick's 2001 and the Possibility of Science Fiction Cinema, now retired Louisiana State University professor of English literature Carl Friedman begins by highlighting Stanley Kubrick's mastery and redefinition of the genres his films worked in, saying, quote, "If the late Stanley Kubrick still enjoys an artistic authority unmatched by any other English language filmmaker, not the least reason is his unique, generic mastery of film as an aesthetic form. No matter the kind of arts and entertainment you prefer, you don't have to look far to uncover something that either influenced or was influenced by Stanley Kubrick." In a certain sense, the ghost of Kubrick still haunts the landscape of popular media today, influencing everything from movies to TV, music, art, and literature. In this podcast, we will hear from scholars and film professors who have studied Kubrick from an academic perspective, and also from up-and-coming filmmakers who are hoping to follow in Kubrick's footsteps. Through it all, we will gain a better understanding of Kubrick's greatness and his lasting impact on popular culture. Even if you don't think you're familiar with Kubrick or his work, you likely are, and you just don't realize it. You are listening to The Ghost of Stanley Kubrick. I'm your host, Cody Maloof. My first three sources are academics who are all very fond of Kubrick's work. They are Professors Paul Helford, Kurt Lancaster, and Carl Friedman. Let's hear from Paul first. Paul is a creative media and film professor at Northern Arizona University and a self-described Kubrick enthusiast. Helford reveres Kubrick as a filmmaker, and he sat down with me to discuss a few of Kubrick's films, what made him such an exceptional filmmaker, and some contemporary films and filmmakers that bear Kubrick's influence.
What I like about Kubrick is he never made the same genre twice. Every one of his films is a different genre. Yet there's that auteur consistency in themes, in style, in technique that you see throughout his movies. His every frame in a Kubrick movie looks like a painting or a photograph. So he's meticulous in his filmmaking, setting up every shot like a photograph. And of course, he started as a photographer, as I'm sure you know. You would go into a Kubrick film not really knowing what to expect, except meticulous production value. He wouldn't necessarily engage you early in his films, or maybe throughout the film, and you have to go back and watch it again. He did not kowtow to popular tastes. He made his own movie each and every time. And I think that's probably what I most appreciate about him.
As our conversation turned towards specific films, Helford used The Shining as one example of Kubrick's influence over an entire genre, and compared the influence of The Shining on horror films to the influence of another massive Kubrick film on a different genre.
It's an adult horror as compared to a lot of previous horror, like the Hammer horror of the 50s and 60s, or the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe horror, just like Space Odyssey. You can't have a sci-fi filmmaker not pay homage to Space Odyssey. That's got to be true of horror films as well. It begins a genre.
Literary critic and philosopher Frederick Jameson thought along similar lines when analyzing The Shining in his 1990 book, Signatures of the Visible, specifically in the chapter titled Historicism in The Shining. Jameson remarked on Kubrick's ability to transcend genre while simultaneously reminding us why genre is important in the first place. Jameson writes, quote, "Kubrick's freedom to reinvent the various generic conventions is at one with his distance from all of them, and with their own historical obsolescence in the new world of television, widescreen, and the blockbuster film. It is as though, to recover some of their old powers, classical genres, such as this one, needed to take us by surprise, and to exert their conventions retroactively." Helford referenced 2001 as being maybe Kubrick's most influential film, explaining that it's almost inconceivable for a modern science fiction film to not owe 2001 a debt of some kind.
Until Space Odyssey, most sci-fi were B movies, silly B movies. I mean, there were some really good ones, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Then you get Space Odyssey in '68, and everything changed. And then Star Wars, and That's it. I mean, it's never looked back except to say, if only there hadn't been a Star Wars, would we still have these great auteur-driven movies that, admittedly, except Godfather, never made a lot of money.
Right, but it was a great auteur-driven movie that didn't make a lot of money that birthed Star Wars and everything else to follow.
Yes, absolutely. And Kubrick was such a totally visual filmmaker, and he uses dialogue very sparingly and not necessarily to tell the story. There cannot be a contemporary sci-fi that does not owe a debt to 2001. It can't exist. It'd be like existing without Shakespeare or Dickens. 2001 is the standard. It is the template for any sci-fi film that follows it.
My second guest, Dr. Carl Friedman, went deeper on the idea that 2001 essentially rebirthed and legitimized the genre of science fiction in film. Friedman makes the case that sci-fi may have never been taken seriously as a genre were it not for 2001.
Well, I think one thing you've got to remember is that before 2001, science fiction cinema was a pretty minor genre of cinema. There had been science fiction films, of course. Actually, as I think I say in the essay, it goes almost all the way back to the beginnings of cinema. But as I say, science fiction cinema was not really considered a major genre either in the popular or the commercial or the critical sense. It was generally regarded that there hadn't been any great science fiction films. And 2001, I think, was absolutely crucial in changing the view of science fiction cinema and the status of science fiction cinema on both sides in both ways. Rather famously, as you probably know, Stanley Kubrick had this idea that there had never been a good science fiction film, but there could be. And it sort of overnight changed the whole critical understanding of science fiction. Here was a science fiction film that was incontestably a major work of cinematic art. I think 2001, that's what outer space looks like, according to our culture, I think. Of course, there had been, films about space travel before, but their attempts to represent what it might look like, what things might look like in outer space, just seem risible, just seem completely amateurish compared to 2001. I remember in the late 60s, early 70s, when the Apollo moon missions were going. This is not something you will remember personally, I'm sure. But one saw actual footage from outer space, right? It was cameras were on these space vessels and beamed back to Earth. And I remember thinking at the time, well, that just doesn't look as realistic as in 2001. 2001 was done in a movie studio. This is actual outer space, but it just didn't seem like it, because I think that's although there probably aren't any filmmakers who don't know 2001, I think it'd be possible for a filmmaker who didn't know it to still be hugely influenced by it, just because so much of that influence is in the air generally, with dozens and dozens of other films.
In his 2014 article, Capitalist Realism in 3 Recent Science Fiction Films, Carl Friedman references 2001 in setting, quote, the gold standard in regards to visual representations of outer space. Friedman goes on to suggest that Kubrick's depiction of space doubles as an allegory for the Cold War and the space race, which was in full swing when 2001 was released in 1968. Friedman says, quote, "In Kubrick's film, the glorious visual representations of outer space ultimately serve a whole theory of human history that incorporates an allegory of the Cold War. 2001 might be described as anti-political because the Soviet-American contest, and by implication all other intra-species conflicts since the dawn of man, are anthropologically reduced to a mindless battle of murderous hominids, and the destiny of Homo sapiens is held to lie beyond the species in outer space." Dr. Kurt Lancaster, a professor of creative media and film at Northern Arizona University, made a similar point to Friedman. He underscored the inevitability that Kubrick and his films represent, specifically 2001. He doesn't see a way in which any contemporary sci-fi filmmaker could avoid 2001, even if they wanted to.
Certainly any person making a serious science fiction film has seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, even if it's just realizing what it takes to make a film of that kind of level of detail that's realistic, because Stanley Kubrick spent the time to make it realistic, and anyone who wants to be realistic would follow his path. Most serious filmmakers have studied Stanley Kubrick at some level, and they know the level of detail he takes in making a film, and they can only hope to come even this close to it, because no one like Kubrick entered that level of perfectionism.
Kubrick was not the type of filmmaker to get bogged down in genre, instead opting to transform or set new definitions for the genres in which his films operated. Kubrick displayed a knack for elevating and redefining genre early on in his career, maybe most profoundly with his 1957 anti-World War I film, Paths of Glory. In his 1971 article/interview with Kubrick for Film Comment, Gene Phillips, a former English and film professor for Loyola University in Chicago, cited Paths of Glory as one of the, quote, "most uncompromising examples of the anti-war genre." More than 30 years later, Phillips' statement still rings just as true. In his article, Phillips also references previous comments on Paths of Glory made by film historian Peter Cowie, who wrote, quote, that Kubrick uses his camera in the film unflinchingly and like a weapon, darting into close-up to capture the indignation on an officer's face, advancing relentlessly at eye level towards the stakes against which the condemned men will be shot, or sweeping across the slopes to describe the wholesale slaughter of a division. Helford agreed with these notions, and added context as to how Paths of Glory changed many notions of what a war film could be.
Even with his early films, like Paths of Glory, remarkable film, war films, for the most part, were gung-ho, American good guys, German, Japanese, whatever, bad guys. But here in Paths of Glory, even though it takes place in France and supposed to be French, we see the side that we are with, in this case, the French soldiers, are just totally victims of power-hungry generals. And I think that was a very unusual take. And then, of course, it's just filmed so beautifully, especially the trench scenes, one of the few anti-war films of its time. I mean, talk about influence. You see Paths of Glory in every World War I film. 1917, Thin Red Line, Terrence Malick. Today, that is influenced to Paths of Glory. It's a World War II film in that the officers are the fools, the idiots, the ones who are making decisions, sending men to their deaths.
My conversation with Paul ultimately shifted in the direction of contemporary films and filmmakers who have been influenced by Kubrick. The first person who came to mind was Christopher Nolan, the filmmaker behind movies such as Interstellar, Inception, Dunkirk, and The Dark Knight. Nolan gave an interview to the BBC in 2019 about his relationship to 2001, the impact it made on him as a filmmaker, and why the movie is as culturally relevant today as ever.
The point of 2001 is the thing itself, is the experience itself. It needs to just wash over you and inform you through the immersion into this extraordinary world. It's in dialogue with our ideas of the future. It's in dialogue with a continually evolving present about what the future represents, what that might be. And the film has never failed to be massively relevant in a cinematic sense and in a storytelling sense. But its technological relevance has sort of ebbed and flowed over the years, depending on what's going on in our world.
Helford sees Interstellar as being most influenced by Kubrick's work, namely by 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Of course, when Matthew McConaughey is watching the video of his son, very similar to Dr. Floyd looking at his daughter on the screen, but you would never see Dr. Floyd or maybe anybody else in a Kubrick film crying like that. In Interstellar, the putting together the story as it goes along, but really not until the ending, much like Space Odyssey, I think is very much Kubrick inspired. Kubrick, and maybe with the exception of some of the earlier films, doesn't really go from point A with his characters to point B. You know, there's not really a character arc that you would expect in most movies.
Next, we discussed the work of filmmaker Todd Field. Field was a protege of Kubrick's, who became obsessed with learning from the master after playing the role of Nick Nightingale in Kubrick's final film, Eyes Wide Shut, in 1999. Field made the pivot from acting to directing in the years following his time with Kubrick, and released his third film, Tar, in 2022. The film bears many significant hallmarks of Kubrick's visual style, treatment of characters, and appeals to the audience. In a recent interview with entertainment journalist Josh Horowitz, Field gave insight into how Kubrick took him under his wing on the set of Eyes Wide Shut, and helped him on his journey to becoming an acclaimed filmmaker in his own right.
I found, I got called to set a lot when I wasn't working, and I was happy to be there because there was nothing for me to do otherwise. And Stanley, very much like Victor Nunez, was very, if you were inside a project together, you were inside a project together. So, he would have me go in the trailer and look at dailies I was involved in, and he would allow me to sort of stand behind him, on set and things like that. So, as a student of film, it was a tremendous, incredible privilege, and it has a, in so many ways, that experience is sort of impossible to talk about. And so he knew I was a student of film. He knew that I had gone through the American Film Institute, although he didn't think very much about that. He didn't believe in any kind of formal education based on how he was built. And so yeah, he understood that I wasn't just interested in acting.
Paul Helford also sees many similarities between Kubrick and Field, both in their modus operandi as filmmakers and in the aesthetic and performative choices both filmmakers make in their films.
You've got a director who's made, 4 movies?
3.
3. Yeah, so he makes fewer movies than Kubrick. He spends a lot of time deciding what to do. And he, like Kubrick, doesn't kowtow to the audience and doesn't tell us, are these good guys or bad guys? I mean, she does have an arc, but ultimately we're left to figure out what this movie is about. I just had read a article, I think it was in Slate, that was asking, is the entire, would be third act from the time she falls on the steps, is that all real or is it a dream? And talk about having to figure things out. I got to the end and I see these costumed characters. I said, what is this? I had to look it up. It's unsentimental, like Kubrick. It leaves us to figure out what it's about. And like Kubrick, it's intellectually profound. It really makes you think. It communicates visually. I mean, this last scene that we're talking about, I mean, it's pure visual communication to the point of I had to figure out what it was. It's objective, detached. All of these are Kubrick.
Helford also referenced the 2022 film Babylon as being a successor to Eyes Wide Shut. Indeed, both films do approach the topics of sex and the lifestyle of the elite in audacious ways. Damien Chazelle, the filmmaker behind Babylon, is certainly another person who wears their Kubrick influence on their sleeve, going so far as to place a direct homage to 2001: A Space Odyssey in his 2018 film, First Man.
Now, think of something like Babylon. That I could see as being a direct successor to Eyes Wide Shut.
It's a very sexual film.
Very sexual. We've also got the Tobey Maguire's Secret Society. And
Chazelle in general, just his mise-en-scène and his entire filmmaking style, I think, is very reminiscent of Kubrick too. Just the amount of stuff that he can put in front of the camera for you is
yes. In Eyes Wide Shut, it was not well received in its day. I remember one particular criticism leveled toward it was Kubrick said, well, it's about sex, and sexuality has not changed since he first thought about it, which was decades earlier. And that was a criticism leveled at it. But I think that it's one of those films that's being reconsidered and is more highly regarded today than it was when it came out.
Another modern filmmaker who Helford cited as reminding him of Kubrick is David Fincher, the acclaimed director of films such as Fight Club, The Social Network, and Gone Girl. Helford sees a lot of similarities between the ideologies of Kubrick's 1971 film A Clockwork Orange and Fight Club.
Fincher as a filmmaker is Kubrick redux, right? I mean, he is such a perfectionist like Kubrick. He obviously makes a lot more movies than Kubrick, but I think of his Fight Club, a dark, disturbed protagonist in rebellion against the order of society strike out. In Clockwork, of course, he strikes out at anybody and anything, whether it's the couple in an isolated home, the hobo under the bridge, his own droogs. In Fight Club, it's not just damage they do to each other, it's damage that they can impose upon society, including that amazing ending. And who's the antagonist in Clockwork Orange? It's really society. And I would say society is probably the antagonist in Fight Club, because that's what they're fighting against, the rules of society in which they are fighting each other to create their club that's eventually going to completely destroy the credit infrastructure with the explosions at the end.
Our conversation ended by discussing the relationship that filmmaker Paul Thomas Anderson has to Kubrick's work. Anderson has been vocal about his appreciation for Kubrick over the course of his career, even once suggesting that the time he got to meet Kubrick on the set of Eyes Wide Shut was akin to meeting God himself. In a 2013 Q&A for his film The Master, Anderson spoke about the breadth of Kubrick's influence on all modern filmmakers, and shared a story of their meeting on the set of Eyes Wide Shut in the late 90s.
Well, let me just say that I don't think there's anybody that hasn't been influenced by Stanley Kubrick. I mean, it's just like, I can't speak for other directors, but it feels like, what he did was kind of a watermark for all of us, just to say, like, this is how you should sort of treat what you do, and this is how you should address it, with a kind of attention, compassion. I was lucky enough to meet him, and it was a great privilege, great honor, and everything else. But it was like he was nice to me when he knew that I directed Boogie Nights, but he was much nicer to me when he knew that I wrote it. Like, it was like, there was a difference. There was a difference between being a kind of a person who directed something and somebody who wrote and directed something, which is pretty cool.
Helford and I discussed Kubrick's influence on Anderson's 2007 film There Will Be Blood, and highlighted Anderson's homage to 2001 A Space Odyssey in his 1999 film Magnolia.
Another filmmaker that I think was very heavily inspired by Kubrick would be Paul Thomas Anderson.
Sure, yes.
Who people say today is maybe the greatest current working filmmaker. Obviously, that's up for debate, but he is one of the names regularly mentioned.
Yes, yes. A lot in production design. You know, I think of There Will Be Blood, where maybe not unlike Space Odyssey, you have 15, 20 minutes before there's a word of dialogue, where we're just in, what's his name? Plainview, where we're just in his world without a word being spoken. I think Kubrick was very intentionally unsentimental and didn't look for easy answers with sentimentality or illusions. There Will Be Blood really has that cool tone that Kubrick would have. And I can really see similarities between Daniel and Alex, where they're just so totally self-serving and nothing matters other than their own success and survival. Like Kubrick, Paul Thomas Anderson doesn't give us answers. We come up with the meaning of the films and the characters. And I think that's really what Kubrick does. I don't know about Magnolia.
The introduction scene to Tom Cruise is a very obvious Space Odyssey nod, right? I wouldn't say so much thematically Magnolia, but that one scene in particular, the Tom Cruise scene,
no question.
It's almost too much on the nose,
Yeah, and not only is Anderson influenced by the music, but the Tom Cruise character would absolutely have been influenced to use that music.
People weren't really familiar with that song or any of the works of Ligeti or any other classical composer that Kubrick used in Space Odyssey. I mean, that, to my knowledge, was not very well-known music at the time.
I certainly didn't know it.
And now it's everywhere. I mean, you can't play Also Spoke Zarathustra without someone recognizing it.
Absolutely.
They might not even recognize it from 2001. They probably don't, in this day and age, recognize it from 2001, but they know it.
Now that we've learned what makes Stanley Kubrick so important in the landscape of cinema, let's hear from two up-and-coming filmmakers who cite Kubrick's work as being highly influential in making them want to make movies in the first place. I first spoke to Michael DiBiasio Ornelas, an independent filmmaker who wrote and directed his second feature film in 2021, titled The Sleepless. DiBiasio Ornelas is currently working on his fourth feature film and took some time to explain how important Kubrick has been to his journey as a filmmaker. I then sat down with Austin Lopez, a sophomore film student at Northern Arizona University. Kubrick is a large part of why Lopez is pursuing a career in filmmaking, and he embodies certain aspects and attitudes of filmmaking that Lopez keeps close to the chest. Up first is my conversation with Michael DiBiasio Ornelas, a self-taught filmmaker who didn't go to film school. He was initially planning on pursuing a career in fiction story writing after college at Columbia University, but eventually decided to pursue a career in filmmaking after encouragement from friends and colleagues. One of Michael's main methods of study was watching films from some of the greatest filmmakers in history, which of course included the works of Stanley Kubrick. Ornelas referenced Kubrick and his films as teaching him about the importance of precise visuals in filmmaking and attention to detail, among other things.
If you're a student of like the medium, especially like in the US, it's you have to study him. Not like you'll be okay if you don't, I guess, but you're gonna get there eventually, even if you're like a younger filmmaker, because he's just one of the masters for good reason. If not by many considered like the master in certain like aesthetic definitions. And so like I think that's just kind of how I landed there. Like I I probably saw, I think the first Kubrick I ever saw was when I was young. So Doctor Strangelove was the first I think that I saw, because it was like, it's an amazing comedy and an amazing satire, but also it's just like just a great funny movie that my parents liked and were rewatching when it came on TV, and so I watched it and loved it. But then when I was at school, like obviously you learn more, you watch more, just like being around like more cinephiles at college. And so I probably watched a few more then. I remember I watched The Killing. Honestly, like my guess is that my screenwriting instructor, when I went into that course and said, "Hey, I want to make a black and white neo noir," that was like one of the things that he told me to watch.
From the very beginning of his filmmaking career, DiBiasio Ornales has been using Kubrick's films as a resource, studying them and applying what he learned to his own projects. One aspect of Kubrick's work in particular that stood out to him was how he uses visuals to tell the story and establish tone. Michael strives to employ his own versions of Kubrick's techniques on his own films, even referencing his film The Sleepless as having certain visual elements inspired by Kubrick.
I think what I learned most from watching his work is like, I think when people talk about him, they talk about like the formal mastery and like the balance, and like there's a lot of talk about perspective and just like the design. So the biggest aspect of his filmmaking that's had an impact on me, I think, is his use of composition. But where Kubrick I think really excelled was like, I guess more than even most contemporary filmmakers, when you watch a Kubrick film, like I feel like it's almost like a 3D experience without the actual technology that like James Cameron is using, right? It's just the level of detail and thoughtfulness is so expert and so above and beyond what so many other people either were able to accomplish or set out to accomplish. That, and it's, the deep focus too and stuff, and how he plays with symmetry, but he just has had a way of capturing your attention and pulling it in to the screen, I think, with a gravity that like few other filmmakers have really matched. It engenders this, I'm theorizing a bit, but it engenders kind of this level of confidence where you can employ some of the tactics that he employed, such as like longer takes, deeper composition, like put all that work on the quote unquote riskier or harder presentation of the scene, where it's about like composition first, and performance is part of that composition. But if you execute as masterfully as he consistently did, then you don't have to cut as much. You can be immersive without having to trick people into it or like steer them towards it with a lot of extra cuts and point of view changes. And like, and it also, like, I think it gives the performers license as well to like really live in the frame. And I think he was able to stick with what he thought was working with the earlier films in our history that were more about composition and where there were fewer cuts and longer takes, and take everything that's great about that, but also like use every modern tool available to really amp up the potential of what can be done within those same constraints. I guess that's a way to put it too, because like as a low budget, like bootstrapping filmmaker, a lot of times like when I'm trying to do something that might be inspired by his aesthetic, like I will do a long take, I will put a lot of extra work into a composition. So like The Sleepless is a decent example in that, like, one of the ways we tried to do a lot despite our slim budget was really work hard on like compositions and lines and depth. A little harder in certain interiors, but on like in certain exteriors we were able to really capture it. Minimalism is kind of the wrong word, but I think it's like the best word. Like, with him, when you're watching something, like the focus is very direct. And so like when I'm producing something, I try to do the same thing. I don't move the camera unless I have a really good reason for it, or the camera is just going to be in motion as like a character and like in something like a tracking shot. But I think that something I really learned from him and made my own and combined with other influences was that kind of like permission, if not desire, to really like sit and wait and like don't waste anyone's time or anything, and like tell the story efficiently, but like set a frame, like have it balanced, like feel good about the composition, and then like just let the camera be there and let the performers or work with the performers to illustrate what you're trying to get across in the scene. Look, I consider him, one of the masters of the medium, especially on a formal level. I watched most of his filmography, some of them a couple of times, to see how a master at work does it. And when someone's that good, you don't even you can't even completely parse it all out on your own. But you can. I just think it's worth paying attention to, if anything, just for a reminder of how performing some of the most fundamental tasks that we need to perform in assembling a shot, a scene, a sequence, a film. It's you just can't help but benefit from that.
Thanks again to Michael DiBiasio Ornales. And now let's go to my conversation with Northern Arizona University film student Austin Lopez. Lopez's passion for film was first ignited when he was in middle school. One of the defining moments of his early discovery of cinema was his first viewing of perhaps Kubrick's most graphic and violent film, 1971's A Clockwork Orange.
When I was getting into filmmaking around middle school, I started watching Kubrick's films, and I believe the first movie of his that I watched in its entirety was, as crazy as this sounds, A Clockwork Orange. I think I was around 5th grade. They were showing it on the...
That's pretty deep for 5th grade.
Yeah, I know, exactly. But it was on the Turner Classic Movies channel, or TCM. And in my head, I was so fascinated with movie syndication and how they edit stuff. So in my head, I'm like, oh, I wonder how they're going to edit this. At the time, I was like, this super controversial movie that I've never seen. And fun fact, they don't. So I just saw the whole movie in its uncut entirety. I fell head over heels in love with it. And then I started checking out some of his other movies. I think right after I saw The Shining, I got into Full Metal Jacket. And then I slowly started watching movies one by one. And he became my favorite director for many reasons.
Lopez cited Kubrick's refusal to make one specific kind of film as something he greatly admires and wants to emulate. He also referenced Kubrick's 1968 masterwork, 2001: A Space Odyssey, as embodying the rare spirit and range that Kubrick possessed.
Being able to film anything from a comedy about war to a drama about war to a space film. Range, that's the word. He has incredible range, and to this day, out of my top 4 movies, my second favorite film of all time is the only film I've seen that I consider to be perfect, completely perfect. I don't see anything wrong with it. 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in 2018, where they brought it into 70 millimeter, I forced my entire family and friends and people to go watch this 70 millimeter screening with me. And to this day, it's the best theatrical experience. And I even took my best friend at the time to watch it in IMAX. And that was just such a fun experience.
Kubrick's 1975 period drama Barry Lyndon was a film that revealed another side of filmmaking to Lopez. It proved to him that films set in olden times don't have to be stuffy and boring, and that any story can be interesting if the storyteller has the right chops.
He was able to make a 3-hour period piece at the age I was, where that was
Spartacus?
Spartacus for sure, but I was thinking of Barry Lyndon.
Oh, okay.
Something that normally I would completely repel from at the age I saw it. I think I was 8th grade when I first saw it. I instantly fell in love with that movie, and I showed it to my entire family, my mom, my sisters, I was blown away at how good he can make this period piece of such a flawed person, sort of like the rise and fall. To make a period piece so entertaining to an 8th grader with ADHD and a low attention span is still crazy to me, and such inspiration to show you can make any story entertaining as long as you're good at telling that story and you have the sort of, not to sound pretentious, but the gravitas of someone like Stanley Kubrick. It's such a, that film especially even, I think that's another one I would almost put in the technically perfect category, especially with how it's lit and how just big the movie is. That's the biggest thing for me. That's why he was my favorite director for the longest time also, is because he just invented new ways to tell the story.
Another trait of Kubrick's that Lopez has co-opted is his fearlessness when it comes to telling potentially controversial stories. Like Kubrick, Lopez also never wants to be afraid of telling the stories that he thinks need to be told.
Like you said, you can't be afraid as a filmmaker to attract the wrong crowd, because you have to know that if you're telling a good story that might have an unlikable character or someone that people aren't supposed to like but might relate to in a way, such as like the 70s film Taxi Driver, if you allow people these days or just people in general to get in the way of you telling an interesting and actually good story, then you can't make a good film. You can't be afraid to. That's one of the biggest things I try to think of in my filmmaking, because I am inspired by a lot of, just a lot of films, whether they be great films, good films, bad films, provocative films. One thing I never want to have in my career is that fear of not being able to tell the story that I want to. I'm never going to intentionally make something to create some sort of reaction or invoke, like to provoke some kind of anger. But some of my favorite directors and some of my favorite films do come from people who were provocateurs. And as the director, you just have to trust that you'll meet the right audience and that you are making the film not only for other people, but for yourself. Stanley Kubrick was such a perfectionist to the point of actually driving some of the people insane. He inspired many others, myself included, to break the conventions of what you thought was capable in filmmaking and to think creatively, to find these new ways to have your story be told and presented in a very interesting way, to where it's almost like an event. Filmmakers these days, I think, are trying their best to entertain as many people as possible, but you get those very few that do that, but also try to just invent new ways to tell their stories. And Kubrick made sure of that when he broke the conventions of what you thought was capable of showing in filmmaking and just doing it. And that's something that is so inspiring to me and has inspired me, throughout the majority of my life. Like going back to the original root of how did Kubrick inspire me as a filmmaker? Just by watching his movies. And you can't explain what 2001 is in words if you tried. You have to see it to believe it. To this day, I have no idea how they did some of the shots in that movie. That is what inspired me, not just like as a filmmaker, but that's what got me, I think, creative and wanting to be like, okay, what can I do differently that either is inspired by something that I've seen or do something that I have never seen before that I'm going to somehow find a way to get done. And seeing Kubrick do that in his movies, he really inspired the creativity within me as someone who wants to go into filmmaking.
A huge thank you to my sources Dr. Carl Friedman, Dr. Kurt Lancaster, Professor Paul Helford, Michael DiBiasio Ornales, and Austin Lopez. I'd also like to thank you, the listener, for taking time to engage with this piece. I hope you now have a better understanding of who Stanley Kubrick was, why his films are so important, and how he has continued to influence pop culture long after his death. I'm Cody Maloof, and you have been listening to The Ghost of Stanley Kubrick. Take care.